All right, so in this little mini lesson, we're going to talk about how classes and methods are like an office building. So we will be basically looking at classes and methods in a different way, and my goal is that I can help those of you that are maybe struggling a little bit with classes and methods. So we're going to explain them and how they all work together in terms of an office building. So what you should see in front of you is you should have a handout that looks somewhat like this, labeled the office, and then I will go through each of these pieces in here, from the methods to the parameters to everything like that, and we will talk about how a class is in fact like an office building. So first things first, the class itself is the entire office room. So each class is essentially one office with its own employees and its own resources. So here we would have the Game 1 class. That's what class I'm representing here. This is the Game 1 class. And this is the big class that we program for our game. So every single class has its own office space. And you can notice that we have some employees in there. We have Mr. Draw and Mrs. Update. And we have some resources on the table like red intensity, green intensity, blue intensity, as well as 2 phones. But the entire office room itself is the class, and it contains all of your resources and your employees. So every single class will have one of these rooms. The graphics device class will have its own office room. The gamepad class will have its own office room. The keyboard class will have its own office room. Things like that. So keep that in mind. Every class is its own entire office room. Then from here, all of the methods are represented by the employees. So keep in mind that methods are in fact actions that can be done. They are miniature programs. They each have their own miniature job. So that is really what the employees are. Our employees are our methods, and you can see here that we have 2 employees. We have Mr. Draw, and that represents method number 1. And then we have Mrs. Update, and that represents method number 2. So we currently have 2 employees, basically stating that we have 2 methods within our class. And each method has a very specific job to perform. So just like every employee in your office has a specific job that they are supposed to be performing, each one of these methods, in fact, has a job that it is supposed to be informing. So keep that in mind. Your employees are your methods. They are the things that have a job to do. They have a specific action that they will perform. So I want to take a little bit of a closer look at each employee. So first, let's focus in on Mr. Draw. And we're going to relate this to the program that we just wrote, and so I will tie this to the code that we wrote in just a second. But I wrote along the side the 3 things that happen while our program is running, basically connecting methods and classes. So first thing I want you to note is there is a phone on the table that says Draw. This phone belongs to Mr. Draw. That is his phone. That is how people reach him and tell him to do his job. So what you'll notice along the side is I have the steps for what will happen, and it starts that each time Draw is called and his phone rings, he's told to do his job. So basically, Mr. Draw is sitting right here in this chair, and when his phone rings, he picks up the ring. He is called. That's where we talked about that method call using the dot method. Somehow he has been called, and every time the phone rings, he's told to simply do his job. So Mr. Draw receives that phone call. He's told to do his job, and if you look in his code, his first requirement is to walk over here to the table, and his job is to find the values of red intensity, green intensity, and blue intensity, because his job, we know ultimately, is to make sure that the screen gets drawn to the correct color. And in order to draw the screen to the correct color, he needs to pick up the red intensity, the blue intensity, green intensity, and the blue intensity values. He needs to know what those are. So he walks over to the table, accesses those 3 values, and then what he does next is he goes to his phone and he calls Ms. Clear. And I will connect this to the code in just a second on the next slide. But he talks to Miss Clear, who is an employee in the graphics device office. And essentially what he does is he gives her these 3 values over the phone. These are the parameters that she needs to clear the screen to the correct color. Then, once he's done with his job, he sits back down in his chair here, and he waits for that next call. So every time he gets a call, he answers the phone, he's told to do his job, walks over to the table, gets those 3 values, picks up the phone, calls Miss Clear in another office or in another class, gives her these 3 values so she can make a color, and then he sits down. That's what he does every single time. All right, so I want to connect what I just said about Mr. Draw to the actual code that we typed in. So first I want you to note that once Mr. Draw receives that phone call, he does these first 2 instructions here. So he knows he's going to make a color. He knows he needs to access the red, green, and blue values that are sitting on the table, those global values that everybody knows. So he walks to the table, accesses those red, green, and blue values, and then knows a specific color that needs to be mixed and put on the screen. Once he knows what that color is, he knows the red, green, blue combination, you can see on that next line that this is actually a method call. So his job involves calling another office. We can see that he needs to call the graphics device class. That's where Ms. Clear, who knows how to clear the background screen to a certain color, is located. So he goes to his phone, and this is where he makes the call, and he calls the graphics device office, or he calls the graphics device class. And inside of the graphics device class is a method, or in this case our employee, called Miss Clear. And Miss Clear knows that her job is to clear the screen to a particular color. So he's calling her to do her job. And what you'll see here is that he gives her over the phone the background color information that she needs in order to clear the screen to the correct color. So he calls her, she clears the screen to the color that he tells her to, and then because of his instructions are done, he sits down and he waits for that next call. So I can relate it just to what I said on the last screen. You can see right here that he uses the values on the table to mix a new color, and then he calls Miss Clear in the next office and tells her which color to clear the background to. All right, so now let's talk about Miss Update. You can see on the screen that Miss Update, just like Mr. Draw, has her own phone as well. And you can see on the first step that each time Miss Update is called and her phone rings, she is told to do her job. So her phone rings, Mrs. Update picks up the phone, she's told to do her job, and so Mrs. Update goes into her code, or goes into her instructions essentially, and she has to access the 3 colors on the table and update the values by 1. So her job consists of increasing the red intensity, blue intensity, and green intensity every single time she is called. She walks over to the table and increases and changes them by 1. And then once she's done, she sits down and she waits for her next call. But her job simply consists of increasing red, green, and blue every time she is called. Now, we can see that here in her code as well, that her code follows that exactly. Every time Miss Update is called, she goes and she does her 3 instructions, her 3 steps. First, she increments red. That happens first. Second, she increments green. Third, she increments blue, and once she's done her job, she can now go and sit down, and she waits for her next call. So that's her job. Her job is simply picking up the phone, being told to do her job, and then increasing red, green, and blue. Now, a special note about the way that Monogame runs is that Monogame runs 60 times per second. So what that means is that Draw and Update, these 2 employees that we've talked about in full, these 2 methods, are called to do their job 60 times per second. So every single time Monogame is running, it calls these employees, it calls these methods to do their job 60 times per second. So Draw remixes the color, recalls Mrs. Clear in the graphics device office, and tells her to mix that screen to a different color 60 times per second. Mrs. Update walks over to the table, increases red, green, and blue by 1, 60 times per second. So keep that in mind as we're working with Monogame, that these methods are being called continuously over and over and over again at a rate of 60 times per second. All right, so the last thing I want to talk about are those values you see on the table, and you can see my picture got moved a little bit, but I'll just reuse my pen to highlight those. So we're looking at the red intensity, green intensity, and blue intensity. And these values on the table are your global variables. So these are things in the class that can be accessed by all methods. So keep in mind that red, green, and blue can be accessed by both Mr. Draw and Mrs. Update. They can be accessed by all methods. If they can be accessed by all methods in a class, they are global variables. If they're out open on the table, if everyone in the class can see them, everyone in the class can change them, everyone in the class can use them. If everyone in the office can use them, if they are open on an open table, they are your global variables or your global objects that can be accessed by all employees. Your local variables, on the other hand, will be things that Mr. Draw and Mrs. Update have contained in their own personal desk. They are variables that only they can access. They are in their own personal desk. Other methods cannot see them. But these global variables, these ones that are sitting on the table, the red intensity, the green intensity, and the blue intensity, those are values and resources that can be accessed and changed by all employees. And because they can be accessed and changed by all employees, or therefore all of your methods in your class, they are in fact the global variables and objects that are found in your game. So kind of keep that in mind as we move forward. So there's your little different look at classes and methods in terms of an office building. Hopefully that clarified some of your questions about classes and methods and how they kind of work together. So you're now done with lesson 3, and you can work on your assignment and then move on to lesson 4.